Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking on something pretty significant. We're diving into the critiques of Islam from various perspectives.
Yeah, and this isn't about us taking sides or anything like that. It's more about understanding the arguments where they come from, whether it's atheists, Christians, Jews, Hindus.
Exactly. How have these different systems framed their disagreements?
Oh.
Because it's complex, right? It touches on theology, history, politics, even current events.
Absolutely. And maybe the most critical thing right at the start is to draw a line. We have to separate, genuine criticism, targeting ideas like maybe questioning laws about leaving the faith from just, prejudice. Bigotry that targets people based on fear or stereotypes.
That's the core task, isn't it? Looking at the claims from our sources and figuring out, okay, is this grounded in texts, in actual history?
Yeah.
Or is it more about misunderstanding, maybe historical trauma or political anxieties playing out?
Especially when you're talking about a global faith of, 1.8 billion people, generalizations are just not helpful. You need rigor.
So let's get into it. The sources suggest the motivations really differ depending on who's doing the criticizing. Where should we start?
Let's begin with the secular challenge. From atheists and humanists, probably one of the most prominent critiques in the West these days.
Right. The sources point heavily towards figures often called the new atheists, people like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins. They seem to frequently single out Islam as a unique kind of threat.
They do. And their core issue is really a fundamental clash of worldviews. It's revealed religion versus secular thinking, liberal governance, human rights as we understand them now.
So what are the specific points they raise?
Well, they hit on several key areas. There are doctrinal and ethical complaints. Things like misogyny get brought up a lot, citing examples like inheritance laws in the Quran, where women traditionally inherit less than men, or historical points like Muhammad's polygamy or his marriage to Aisha when she was young.
These are used as examples of how traditional religious law might clash with modern ideas of equality.
Precisely. But often, the most, let's say, explosive arguments revolve around violence in the scriptures.
Yes. Verses like Quran 9.5, the one about slaying idolaters. That gets cited quite a bit in these critiques.
It does. And the significance here for the secular critics goes beyond just the text itself. It feeds into a critique of governance.
Oh, so?
They argue that Islam, or at least certain interpretations, resist reform because the Quran is seen by many Muslims as the literal, unchangeable word of God. And they link this perceived resistance to reform to real-world outcomes like blasphemy laws or theocratic tendencies in some states.
And the apostasy laws fit in here too.
Critically, the idea that leaving the faith could carry a death penalty, they point to specific texts like Hadith Sahih Bukhari. Well, for a humanist perspective, that's a fundamental violation. The state dictating belief. That's the ultimate crossing of the line for individual liberty.
Okay, so if we analyze the motivation behind this secular critique, it sounds like it's not just an intellectual disagreement.
No, it's definitely a mix. There's a logical challenge to beliefs they see as irrational or harmful, but you can't deny that this logic often gets amplified by a kind of cultural fear.
Fear of what, exactly?
Fear of the other, perhaps. Specifically, an anti-secular force that seems resistant to modern liberal norms. The critique has logical grounding. They point to data like Pew Research showing support for Sharia, including harsh punishments in various Muslim-majority countries. That's verifiable.
But then the fear element comes in.
Right, because that support doesn't mean everyone wants ISIS, right?
Yeah.
Fear gets magnified, especially post-9/11. Media coverage tends to zoom in on extremist acts by a tiny, tiny fraction of Muslims. ISIS might cite Quranic verses, sure, but the constant media focus makes that fringe element seem much larger, much more representative than it actually is.
So the secular challenge is really centered on this idea of whether faith can be or should be purely private, when its texts touch on law, punishment, the state.
That's a great way to put it. Can a doctrine stay private if it inherently includes rules for public life? That's the core tension they highlight.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's shift gears. From the secular political conflict to something different. The theological rivalry within the Abrahamic family, Christians and Jews.
Yeah, this is a whole different dynamic. Here, the conflict goes right to the core beliefs.
With Christianity, it seems the absolute bedrock issue is Christology, right?
Yeah.
Who Jesus was.
Exactly. Islam fundamentally denies what is central to Christianity. Jesus' divinity and his crucifixion as an act of salvation. The Quran explicitly calls the Trinity blasphemy and denies the crucifixion actually happened. It's an irreconcilable difference from the get-go.
And this leads to the concept of supersessionism. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. Supersessionism is basically the idea that one religion has replaced or fulfilled the promises of an earlier one. Christians traditionally saw Christianity as fulfilling Judaism. Islam, in turn, teaches that Muhammad and the Quran are the final perfected revelation, superseding both Judaism and Christianity. For Christians and Jews, this is seen as negating their own sacred history and covenant with God.
The sources also often bring up the contrast between founders, Jesus' teachings on peace versus Muhammad's role as a military and political leader, and things like the Quran permitting slavery.
Right. These historical and moral contrasts are highlighted. Doctrinally, the Christian critique makes sense because the core claims about God and salvation are just incompatible. But like with the secular critique, history weighs heavily here.
Centuries of conflict.
Centuries. The Crusades, the Ottoman expansion into Europe, these are deep historical traumas on both sides. And when you see modern issues like the persecution of Coptic Christians in Egypt, for example, it reinforces that historical fear, that defensiveness. Even though there are positive interfaith efforts happening too, that history looms large.
Okay. And for Jewish critiques, supersessionism is key there too, but the history feels even more complex maybe.
It is complex. Again, Islam accepts the Torah, but claims Muhammad is the final prophet, fulfilling earlier prophecies. From a traditional Jewish perspective, that's like a theological takeover of their unique relationship with God. The historical record is definitely mixed.
You mean periods of tolerance alongside persecution?
Exactly. There was the Golden Age in places like Abbasid Spain, where Jewish culture flourished under Muslim rule. But there were also terrible periods. The 1066 Granada massacre is often cited. And then there was the institutionalized system.
The dhimmi status.
Yes, the dhimmi system. Jews and Christians were protected peoples, but they weren't equals. They faced specific social limitations and had to pay a special tax, the jizya. It codified a second-class status, even while offering a degree of communal autonomy and protection compared to, say, pagan groups.
But the sources seem clear that today, a lot of this historical tension is viewed through a modern lens.
Overwhelmingly. The Israel-Palestine conflict dominates the modern Jewish perception of Islam for many. When extremist groups like Hamas use religious rhetoric, including hadiths interpreted as calling for violence against Jews, the issue transforms from an old theological debate into a very real, present-day existential threat.
So fear plays a huge role here too.
A massive role. It's often framed as a post-Holocaust survival instinct reacting to perceived threats in contemporary Islamist discourse. The historical context is there, but the immediate driver is often modern geopolitics and security concerns.
So, pulling the Abrahamic critiques together, the core insight seems to be about mutually exclusive claims to being the final truth. It's like a family argument over who gets the inheritance, and both sides insist it's solely theirs.
That captures it well. It's a rivalry rooted in shared origins, but divergent claims to finality. Now let's shift again, this time moving east. Critiques from Hindu and other Eastern traditions, this brings in completely different issues.
Right, less about Abrahamic succession, more about cultural clash.
And invasion, iconoclasm, historical wounds. The theological starting point is starkly different.
How so?
Well, you have Islam's absolute, uncompromising monotheism, Tawhid, the oneness of God, set against Hindu traditions that embrace polytheism, or at least multiple manifestations of the divine, and widespread use of images or idols in worship. The Quran condemns idolatry shirk as the greatest sin. This creates an inherent theological friction.
And historically, this friction played out violently in the Indian subcontinent.
Brutally. The sources are full of accounts that are deeply ingrained in historical memory there. Things like the destruction of temples during various periods, particularly under rulers like Mahmud of Ghazni, who famously raided the Somnath temple. There are historical estimates, though debated, of massive population decline among Hindus over centuries of invasions and rule.
These are specific documented events we're talking about.
Yes, events like Timur's sack of Delhi in 1398, where historical accounts record the massacre of huge numbers of Hindu captives. And the trauma isn't just ancient history. The violence during the 1947 partition of India and Pakistan is still a living memory for many. Similar grievances exist among Sikhs, Buddhists, and Yazidis, who also faced persecution under certain Muslim rulers like Aurangzeb.
So the historical basis for the grievance seems quite solid. How does that translate into modern critiques? Is it purely about history, or is politics involved too?
Like the other critiques, it's a mix. The historical narrative provides a powerful foundation, but today it's often amplified by political movements, like the rise of Hindutva or Hindu nationalism in India, which frames Islam as fundamentally foreign, an invader, a colonizing force that disrupted indigenous culture.
Is that narrative entirely accurate, though? What about conversions?
Well, that's where nuance is important. The narrative of purely forced conversion is often an oversimplification. While forced conversions certainly happened, historians also point to other factors, people converting for social mobility, to escape the caste system, or genuinely attracted to the message, perhaps through Sufi mystics. But the memory of violence and cultural disruption is potent, and it's definitely used politically today.
So the insight here is about a clash between absolute monotheism demanding exclusivity versus traditions embracing multiplicity, a conflict over the legitimacy of diverse forms of worship.
Exactly. It's a clash over whether different ways of seeing and worshiping the divine can coexist when one tradition views the others as fundamentally wrong, as shirk. Okay, so we've looked at secular, Abrahamic, and Eastern critiques. If we try to synthesize all this, what are the real underlying drivers? What connects these threads?
It feels like the critiques are rarely completely fabricated, but they almost always seem magnified by emotion, right? We sort of identified three main pillars.
Let's recap them. Pillar 1, genuine theological disagreement. You just can't logically reconcile strict monotheism, Tawhid, with the Christian Trinity or Hindu polytheism. These are fundamental principal differences about the nature of reality.
Pillar 2, genuine conflict of values. This is where the secular and humanist critiques really land. Traditional interpretations of Sharia regarding things like apostasy, blasphemy, gender roles, they logically clash with modern secular democratic values centered on individual rights and freedoms. It's a fight over where authority lies, divine law or human reason and consensus.
And Pillar 3, historical and political grievances. This is huge. Centuries of real conflict, conquests, wars, colonialism from all sides at different times, crusades, jihads, Mughal rule, European colonization. This stuff leaves deep scars and shapes subconscious biases, even when people think they're being objective about current events.
Okay, so you have these three valid, or at least understandable, bases for critique. What then turns that critique of an idea or a history into generalized prejudice against people today? What's the main accelerator?
Overwhelmingly, it seems to be fear fueled by distorted representation. Modern geopolitics, the Israel-Palestine conflict, Iran's government, the actions of groups like ISIS gets conflated with Islam as a whole. And the media landscape, especially in the West, often plays a huge role. Sources suggest negative stories about Islam get disproportionately high coverage compared to positive ones or compared to negative stories about other groups.
Which leads directly to the problem of generalization.
Precisely. The actions of the most extreme fringes or the policies of repressive states like Iran with its hijab laws get presented implicitly or explicitly as if they represent the entire diverse reality of 1.8 billion Muslims worldwide. That's the slip. Moving from a valid criticism of, say, a specific law in Saudi Arabia to a generalized suspicion or hostility towards all Muslims. That is essentially what Islamophobia is.
So keeping that distinction clear between principled critique of ideas or actions and prejudiced generalization against people, that's the absolute key takeaway here.
It really is. Acknowledging valid concerns without falling into sweeping generalizations based on fear or historical baggage. That's the challenge.
And the sources leave us with one last, quite pointed thought to consider, don't they? Something about Islam and state power.
Yes, it's a provocative point. The argument made in some sources is that Islam's traditional framework, which historically included concepts like Dar al-Islam, the realm of Islam, and Dar al-Harb, the realm of war or non-Islamic territory, suggests a unique blending of faith and state power. This, some argue, makes its integration into secular multi-faith societies inherently more complex compared to faiths that underwent a more complete separation of church and state.
Which raises a really difficult final question for us to think about. Can things like interfaith dialogue or focusing on shared Abrahamic roots truly bridge these deep theological and political differences if the parts of scripture or tradition calling for distinct legal or political orders are, well, ignored or downplayed? Or does ignoring those potentially valid points of conflict just lead to more misunderstanding and alienation down the road?
That's the uncomfortable question, isn't it? How do you have honest dialogue that acknowledges both common ground and fundamental disagreements? Something definitely to mull over.